This happened a couple of years ago when I was a senior in high school living in Southern California. It was later in the evening, sometime between 8 to 8:30, and my mom and I had just gotten home from a long day of driving and visiting family to discover that our cat was completely out of food. I was tired of being in the car and did not want to go to the pet shop to get cat food. My mom begged me to go with her, so I finally caved in and said yes. Looking back now, I am so grateful that I did, because if I hadn't decided to go, I think there's a good chance my mom would have never came home. Another important detail I want to mention is that the windows of the car my mom had were extremely tinted, making it pretty much impossible to see into the car. So we pull into the parking lot, and I look around and notice there's only a few other cars, with one parked a few rows to the back of us. My mom says I can wait in the car since she is just going in real quick to pick up the food. A minute after my mom walks out of the car and is halfway to the store, the car that was parked a few rows back pulls up in the spot right next to our car on the passenger side. I think it's a little strange, but think maybe the person wanted a closer spot to the store. A man steps out of the car and gets his big German Shepherd out of the back of his car and walks into the store. I'm looking inside the store and notice this guy is watching my mom and following her around, but enough for her to notice. He gets ahead of her in line, and after he checks out, he stands outside the entrance and is watching her check out. My mom walks out of the store and the guy starts walking behind her. At this point, I'm starting to get a really bad feeling, and I am very creeped out. When my mom makes it back to our car, she opens the back to put the cat food, and the guy opens the back of his car right next to ours and starts talking to her and motioning for her to come look at something in the back of his car. My mom, being completely oblivious, takes a few steps over and is looking into the back of his car. His hands start to move towards his waist, and I immediately start yelling for her to get into the car right now. The guy looks super shocked, as I'm guessing he never saw me in the car, and stops talking to her. My mom looks very confused, but after I yell at her some more to get into the car, she finally does. The creepy guy immediately gets into his car and drives off in a hurry. When my mom gets into the car, I asked her what that guy was saying to her, and she tells me he was telling her to look at something he got for his dog that was in the back of his car. I tell her everything I observed and that I am pretty sure he was trying to abduct her. Creepy pet shop guy, let's not meet ever again. Some quick backstory. I worked security for a private company. Before that, I was working at a hospital, but occasionally I'll pick up a shift somewhere else. My city was holding an all-ages concert that took place in the city square. I took the shift as we had the contact, and due to unforeseen circumstances, our field manager was unable to make it at the last minute, so he put me in charge of the officers on site and communicated with me throughout the event via text. Anyway, most of the event goes fine. We have a few issues with some people drinking and arguing, and one man who is very drunk and attempted to assault us, but his friend kept stopping him and dragged him away while apologizing to us. I had 7 officers, not including myself, as well as 8 or 10 police officers who were present and gave us a hand when we needed it. At about 12:15, a lot of the crowd is cleared out, and my officers are leaving their spots and are all standing towards the center of the stage, in front of the gate, just watching the 50-ish people that are still standing around, talking and hanging out. Two of my officers come and tell me that at one point they noticed a short white man in his late 50s or so, just standing very close to and staring at a younger girl, probably around 20, who was very intoxicated and there alone. It was clear she didn't know him, so they decided to go stand near her, with one of them standing directly between the two and staring at the man. After 30 seconds of this, he apparently got the hint and walked away. Just after they finished telling me this, they pointed the girl out, and I noticed the man they described standing close to her again. I don't think I've ever seen a look that malicious in my entire life. He was just standing 3 feet away from her, while she sloppily danced and flailed herself around, staring at her intensely. He was obviously sober and clearly didn't have good intentions. At this point, I signaled to one of my other officers and we both approached. We got between them and I took the girl aside while he told the man that he was making us uncomfortable and that he had to leave. Eventually, he was told that the police were standing about 40 feet away and that if he didn't comply for us, we would gladly get them, and he walked away. I tried for a while to calm the girl down and get her a cab, but she was far too drunk and we couldn't get her to sit and stay with us. So ultimately, we just had to let her go. We kept an eye on her as she went up the street, and that's all we could really do. He had left about 10 minutes before her, and he went into the opposite direction, so I hope he didn't find her again. I still regret not being able to do more. I was kind of hoping she would have assaulted one of us, so we could have a reason to restrain her and let the cops deal with her, so she'd be a bit safer. But all she did was try to jump our fences and piss behind a garbage can, so we couldn't really do anything to help. A few years ago, I was in the process of getting a divorce. My wife had left me for another guy, and I was at a pretty low point. My closest friends were her brothers-in-law, and while they stuck by me, it felt weird to me at the same time to be hanging out with my soon-to-be ex's family. So I was spending a lot of time alone. I could not handle standing at the house all the time by myself, and pretty much any excuse to get out was something I jumped it on, which is how I ended up at a concert at a local bar alone, and where this story really begins. I was actually pretty excited to see this band. They were from our area, but have managed to become pretty big nationally, and they're very popular around here. I showed up early so I could get a seat at the bar and chill rather than have to stand in front of the stage and not have room to move. I ended up waiting for the doors to open with a relatively small group of people, maybe 15 or 20 of us. One of the others waiting at the door was her. She had the look of someone who'd been on some very heavy drugs for years. I could tell she was probably around my age, but she looked at least 20 years older than she actually was. I could also tell she was currently on something, and had also been drinking pretty heavily before coming to the bar. She was staggering and slurring her words, but just managed to keep it together enough that they didn't kick her out. She was wearing what I assume she thought was concert attire, but she honestly looked like a prostitute, a tube top with a way too small jacket over it and an extremely short skirt. This was in February and it was snowing and about 20 degrees, I am assuming she thought she was hot. She was disgusting. She was standing with a group of 4 or 5 people, but kept looking my direction and making me feel very uncomfortable when I caught her looking at me. Anyway, they finally let us in, and I found a spot at the bar where I thought I'd be able to see the stage pretty well. Settled in and ordered a beer. This woman and her group wandered around for a bit until it started getting crowded and then ended up standing very near to me. She was close enough for me to smell her. Awesome. Once the warm-up bands started playing, I managed to enjoy myself. A couple at the bar next to me ended up being pretty cool, and I spent some time talking to them between bands. I had planned on only having a couple of beers since I was alone and I had to drive home in the snow. But the guy ended up buying a bucket of beers without asking me and wanted to split in. He's been cool, so I was like, what the hell, I call a cab if I have to. By the time the main band started, I was on my 6th and feeling pretty good. It was at this point that the crack whore started hitting on me. I told her I wasn't interested, and she moved back to her group for a couple of songs. It wasn't long before she was back though. This time, she started grinding all over me and ended up falling into my lap. I tried to help her get off me as politely as I could, while hiding my disgust. I am pretty laid back and don't like to be rude to people, so I was still trying to be nice at this point. Unfortunately, instead of taking the hint, she turned and wrapped her arms around my neck, and I was forced to stand up and practically dumped her off me. If she hadn't had a grip on me, I have no doubt she'd been on the floor. I forcibly peeled her off me and once again told her I wasn't interested, and she sulked back to her friends. The next person who came over was one of the girl's male friends. "What's wrong with you, man? She really likes you. You gay or something?" Again, tried to be as polite as possible. I replied, "No, I am not gay. I'm just not interested. Sorry." The two I'd befriended luckily had my back and told the dude to fuck off. The girl even told him I was out of that crack whore league, which definitely made me feel pretty good about myself. He went back to their group and they moved away, and I went back to enjoying the concert and had a great time. After the show, the couple told me they actually knew the band and asked if I wanted to meet them. Of course I did. Plus, I needed some time to sober up before going home anyway, so they led me out back where the band's tour buses were. I say tour buses, but they were mostly old RVs. Anyway, go to meet the bands and hang out with them for a bit, which was awesome. I was offered more beer and other things of the greener variety, which I declined, knowing I needed to go home at this point. It was then that I noticed Crack Whore and her group were still around, and they were all staring daggers at me. 3 girls and 2 guys. Once I saw this, I sobered up even faster and finally decided it was probably time to leave, since the crowd was getting pretty thin and I definitely didn't want to be there anymore. I walked pretty quickly to my car, which was in a fairly empty area of the parking lot, and I could hear the group behind me. I jumped in and headed out. Unfortunately, they followed. I could see them get in another car and pull out behind me. It's still snowing, and I know I probably still shouldn't be driving, even on clear roads, so I'm trying to stay calm and not to do anything to get pulled over. When I hit the highway and they were still right on my butt, I decided, screw it. So I started trying to lose them. The roads were slick, but I was in an SUV and they were in an old beater with presumably crappy tires. In the first sharp turn, I look. I skidded a little on the snow, but held it on the road. They were not so lucky. I watched them slide off the side of the road and into the ditch and chuckled to myself victoriously. I am not heartless though. Even when somebody deserves it, I wasn't going to leave 5 people possibly injured in a ditch to freeze to death. Plus, I was pretty sure they were gonna go to jail, so I called 911 and told them about the accident. I didn't stop or mention that they were chasing me though. I did not want to talk to the cops or to go back and have to see them again. And I was also pretty sure that while I felt completely sober at this point, I probably still wouldn't pass a breathalyzer myself. So I just made the call and went home. Not sure what ended up happening with them, but I never saw them again, despite going to plenty of concerts in the same area since. This happened over 10 years ago, when I was in junior high, about 14 years old. I went to a high school in the inner city, in a high crime area with a reputation of being tough school, though my friends and I were pretty well behaved. I had these two best girlfriends and we did everything together. Well, one day after school, we decided to go to the McDick's across the street for a snack. While we were sitting down, we all noticed an older man sitting by himself and staring at us. He looked a little shabby and was wearing a Santa hat, which was odd considering it was only September or October. We were a bit creeped out, but didn't think much of it because this particular McDonald's was often host to the neighborhood's eccentric but mostly harmless homeless population. We left and headed our usual route home. We all lived within a block of each other, so we usually walked home together. A few minutes passed and we noticed the Santa hat man was walking behind us. Getting an uneasy feeling and remembering what we'd been taught about being followed by strange men, we decided to turn left instead of crossing a major street to the right where we lived. We didn't want to lead him to where we lived if he was indeed following us, and if he wasn't, his destination wasn't likely in the more well-to-do neighborhood. Well, as you may have guessed, he did not continue on or turn right, but followed us into the nicer area. We were getting worried now and quickened our pace until we reached an interesting street, turned right and turned right again along the next street, heading back in the direction we came from. Once we rounded the corner, we watched to see if he had followed us, and indeed he had, most joking to keep up. Well, now 3 was no doubt that he was actually stalking us, so we grabbed hands and flat out ran down the block, cutting through yards and zigzagging throughout the area in order to lose him. We made it back to the major street and waited to see if he could turn up. Thankfully, he was nowhere in sight, so he hurried across the street and nervously made it home safe. I'm still not sure what the Santa hat man, as we called him, intended to do if he ever caught up with us. I am a tiny little person, but both my friends were big and tall for our age, just about as tall as the Santa hat man was. I think because of this, we weren't too concerned about the situation, even after it happened. We even made jokes about it afterwards, but I still never told my mom out of fear she would never let me out of the house, and I am glad we never found out what the man wanted from 3 14-year-old girls. So Santa hat man, let's never meet again. My older brother used to be in a relationship with this girl. They fought a lot, but at the end of the day, always seemed to be fine. These all happened when I was a child, so I don't remember it all too well, but I remember bits and pieces of her. She grew up in a bad household. Her mother was quite abusive. She overreacted about every little mistake she made. My brother used to be a bad kid. He was with the wrong crowd, and it really fucked up his life in a lot of ways. He was a really good musician. His path was lined for him in a musical career. He could have been famous. I'm rambling back the main story. Once I remember we had to call the police on her for not leaving our property. She left in time, but that memory of her and my brother's screams echoed throughout my mind. However, it was around this time something happened. Something great. He and my father went to see a movie about a Navy SEAL. That made my brother want to join the Navy. He's still in it now. However, my parents in his eyes messed something up. Finally, my brother made one of the biggest mistakes of his life. He proposed. After the ceremony, he immediately went home and wanted a divorce. A little after this time, it was finally time to go to boot camp. When he left, she came to live with us. She rarely interacted with any of us, going to work, then home to her room. I actually have her room now. Once my brother came back from boot camp, him and his wife went to live at the base he was stationed at. This is when the real hell happened. Her entire life was based on him. He was her only stability. She didn't know how to be a person without him. When he was deployed on the ship, she went insane. She tried to smuggle drugs onto base. He sold his stuff for drugs, almost killed his dog. She destroyed his home, and there was nothing he could do about it. After all was said and done, she left and went to be with my brother's best friend. She now has a baby and is barely making it through life due to addiction. I still have nightmares that I will see her again, and if I do, I know exactly what to do. My brother is now married and has a 2-month-old baby boy. This takes place in October 1977, when my mom was 16. She ran away from her abusive home along with her friend Lisa. They hitchhiked from us all the way to California. Obviously, this wasn't the brightest of plans, but given my mom's home life and past experiences, she didn't see how it could be much more dangerous than anything she'd already experienced. They had a pretty safe and uneventful trip across the country, finding friends and many truck drivers and other travelers. It wasn't until they reached California when this encounter happens. The hillside strangler ended up being 2 men who were caught and brought to justice for 10 murders. So my mom and Lisa end up meeting these 2 guys who were super nice to them. They crashed at their place for a few days, partying, but nothing bad had come off at this point. These guys tell the girls that they are going to take them to the Hollywood Hills. Not being from the area, my mom had no idea that these areas were more crime-ridden that time, especially considering they were supposed to be sightseeing. My mom really wanted to see where all the movie stars lived. These guys take my mom and her friend to some divey restaurant bar and get them super drunk. It's also the first time my mom is introduced to and tries cocaine. After these underage girls are now completely high and drunk, they split off into pairs and my mom's friend disappears with one of these guys. My mom is now hanging out with just one of her new guy friends. He then suggests that they stand on the sidewalk, and if a car pulls up, she should get in and direct the driver to drive across the street to this dark parking lot. It isn't really until the first and only car pulls up and she gets in and that she has realized this guy is prostituting her out. Keep in mind, these guys had been nothing but kind and respectful to my young mom and friend for the past few days. Also, and very sadly, this type of abuse is not a new concept for her either. She gets into this car and instead of pulling into the parking lot, he keeps driving straight. My mom explains that he's gone the wrong way, so he starts driving faster. My mom moves towards the door, but he locks it, hits her, and attempts to hold her down at the same time. He tells her she isn't going to go anywhere. My mom knew in her head she needed to get the fuck out of the car or she would be dead. So in one swift move, she unlocks the door, tucks and rolls out of the car. His car comes screeching to a halt. She sees some bushes in front of a house, so she runs to and hides behind them. He's turned around, looking for her, creeping along. His passenger side was facing where she was hiding, and she was peeking through the bushes. She saw he had a gun. As soon as his car crept by, she ran to the backyard. It was all fenced in. There was no other way out, so she had to go back the way she came. By the time she crawled back into the bushes to see if he was still around, she saw his car had gone to the end of the road and turned back around. So he passes again, and when she thought he was far enough away, she crawled out of the bushes to run. But then she sees his brake lights. Confident that he's now seen her, she runs as fast as possible around a corner. But she could hear his car, so she had to duck and hide behind parked cars on the road. As soon as he passes again, she looked it across the street, which took her through the parking lot she was originally supposed to park in, and back to her friend. The creep did circle back again, but by then she was with her friend and they were leaving the area. My mom and her friend quickly ditched these two assholes and did find a safer place to stay. But only a short time later did my mom call home and eventually made it home safely. It wasn't until a long time later that she saw on the news a story about two women being murdered and recognized the murderer, dubbed the Hillside Strangler as the man who had picked her up that night. This happened to me just last night, so I wanted to recount it while the details were all still fresh in my head. Yesterday evening, I went to the cinema with a friend after work and was making my way home around 12 a.m. or so. In my neighborhood, there's a large park that separates the two sides of the estate, and it's a good shortcut for getting to the street my house is. Now, before I go on, I should mention that I live in an extremely safe suburban town in the east of Ireland. I could probably tell you all the major crimes that have happened here in the past 20 years off the top of my head. It's known as being a place that is totally calm and very out of harm's way. I walked through this park countless times after dark, sometimes as late as 3 a.m. after a night out with friends, and I've never once come across anything weird or creepy. That changed last night. The park is very big and is mostly a wide open space. You can basically picture it as the perfect place for kids to play a game of football because there's not a lot of trees or bushes in the way. There's also street lamps or light sources. I was walking up the trail that runs along the border of the park, and as I got above halfway along, a big shape right in the middle of the open space got my attention. It was motionless, so at first I thought it was some sort of goalpost or marker that kids had left behind after playing. But then, as I got closer, it began to move towards me, and I saw it was a person. The entire park was deserted except for the two of us, and I thought it was odd he'd been standing still right in the middle of it. Most people just use the two trails on either side. It was difficult to see in the dark, but it looked like a tall man in a long coat with shaggy hair. I looked around for a dog to see if he was out late walking his pet, but saw nothing. He was just slowly starting in my direction. I looked away from him and picked up my pace, telling myself not to be ridiculous. He was probably just crossing the park, and was only walking towards me. I glanced back at him and saw that when I'd sped up, he'd changed his direction to follow me, still at the same slow pace. I looked away again and walked quicker, but glanced back a few seconds later to make sure he wasn't still following me. He was, but then he stopped, turned away, and started motioning with his hands. Think about a traffic warden gesturing for a car to move forward. It looked like he was beckoning something to come towards him. I broke into a light jog for the rest of the park, looking back a few times to make sure he hadn't suddenly started into a run after me. But no, he was still making that same signal right where I'd left him. I kept up a quick pace all the way to my road, hurried up the driveway to my house, and shuddered when I closed the front door behind me. Even when I walked down through the park this morning on my way into town, I felt uncomfortable when I passed by where he had been. The experience left a bad taste in my mouth.